We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition show, we are talking trouble in Democrat City, what's happening with Joe Biden, and a whole lot more. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio is sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. And you're on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to be joined by a long-time host of this here radio show and Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner. Thanks for coming in, Tim.
Hello, Mark.
So you've been, what's the right way to describe this? You're writing on Liberty Nation this last week or so. It's a cross between poetry and polemic. I think it's been fantastic. And the target of your...
Well, you could just say it's polemic poetry.
We could say that. We could say that.
Or poetic polemics.
Yeah. The target has
one way or the other. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome. It's well worth a read, those of you listening on the radio here. The particular target that you've been looking at this week is the rather depressing destruction of the Democratic Party, but also, in particular and specifically, their inability to understand why Joe Biden was such a harbinger of their 2024 demise. And it seems that some people are realizing it, but they're still refusing to look at any remedies towards that. And I think it's an almost fatalistic approach that leading members of the Democratic Party have at the moment towards their position, because unless you recognize a problem, you're doomed to repeat it again and again. And you wrote a fascinating piece called "Biden is Back as Infuriated Democrats Cringe," and it's fantastic. Give us the brief overview just for those who might want to go and read it.
Well, I guess the bottom line is that the Democratic Party, because their past is so distressing and they haven't figured out the future, they're sort of stuck in a time warp. And Joe Biden returning to the scene of the crime, so to speak, to the public square with appearances on BBC and most notably The View, were definitely cringeworthy stuff for Democrats. One of the Democratic strategists that I quoted in the story referred to Biden's refusal to even admit that he was in any sort of cognitive decline. And the fact that he also said on The View that he would have beaten Trump, and the only reason he pulled out was not because of his catastrophic debate or his cognitive decline, but because he didn't want to, quote, divide the Democratic Party. To which the strategist I referred to said, it's the equivalent of political insanity, entirely detached from reality. And once again, he's being pushed out in public when I think about 99.9% of Democrats, perhaps everyone except his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, wants him to stay in the basement from whence he came and to which he returned once Kamala Harris had to carry the banner for him and was so thoroughly defeated in December. This is the last thing Democrats wanted to see, was a reemergence of Joe Biden. It was just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong and the man who caused the party to fall into shambles.
But surely, Tim, I heard from so many pundits that Kamala Harris was the perfect candidate who ran a perfect campaign. So one would assume that part of the blame does fall on Kamala Harris as well.
Well, you know, when Democrats say that Kamala Harris ran a perfect campaign, of course, that's far from the truth. I think, though, you could make the case that she ran an error-free campaign. And that's because she took no chances. She said nothing. she fell back on bromide, such as I was raised in a middle-class family, which she repeated dozens and dozens of times.
May I interject there, Tim? I was raised in a middle-class family. Whenever she said that, I thought back to Steve Martin in one of his earliest film roles, The Jerk. And I believe that starts, I was raised a poor black child.
Yes.
And every time she said, hey, I was raised in a middle class, I started thinking, when's she going to get the banjo out and start tap dancing on the front porch?
Well, she was an incredibly inept candidate, of course. But she made no errors because she took no chances and talked about nothing except platitudes and bromides and, heavily, shall we say, airbrushed language from her strategists. But I mean, it's not her fault that the Democrats lost that election so badly. She did the best she could with her extremely limited political skills. It was Joe Biden. It's all about Joe Biden. He was ground zero for the utter collapse of the Democratic Party. And he still won't even admit, Mark, that he should have either not run for a second term or that he should have dropped out much earlier when it was obvious he wasn't up to a second term. And who you want to blame for all this, you can blame Biden. But the fact that he was basically the 4 books that have been written specifically about the 2024 election campaign, all came to the conclusion that Joe Biden was essentially in a fog for months, if not years. So who made the decision to keep him in? The obvious culprit was Dr. Jill Biden. And it was like a blast from the past when the two of them went together on The View. And once again, Joe Biden was unable to answer a question, and his wife had to step in to answer it for him, just like she had to step in to run his last cabinet meeting because he was so out of it that he couldn't even answer questions, even when they were pre-scripted for his cabinet members.
I find it quite rich that the people who, even though Elon Musk was legally appointed to his position at the head of Doge with 120, I think it was 120-day term limit, the self-same people had no words that Jill Biden was running a cabinet meeting for the president. I mean, nobody elected Jill Biden, not a single vote, not a Senate confirmation for Jill Biden. And yet she was leading a cabinet discussion, presumably about things which would be classified to a certain level, presumably without any particular clearance other than the fact that she's Joe Biden's wife.
Well, not only that, but his closest advisor, who by many accounts was calling the shots.
The smartest guy he knows, right?
Hunter Biden. Yeah. I mean, Hunter Biden was in the Oval Office and serving as a de facto chief of staff after he'd been convicted of real crimes, unlike Donald Trump. And so, I mean, the whole thing was just a pathetic show. And I think the bottom line, Mark, is that Joe Biden cost the Democrats so dearly that they may not recover for years, if not a generation.
We'll continue analyzing this after we get back from this short break.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.